Excellency, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and members of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, colleagues and friends. It gives me great pleasure today to have been asked to launch this book, Brazil in the World, by Dr. Sean Burges. It's Sean's second book on Brazilian foreign policy, and I think with this and a variety of other prestigious articles, it establishes him as a foremost authority on Brazilian foreign policy in the academic literature. And I say this because this is a book which has great ambitions. It looks at a long period, a 25-year period of Brazilian foreign policy, and it does so through a series of levels of complexity, some of which I'll very briefly mention in this introduction. And it does so, I think, with great skill and great nuance. And it does so, as he mentions in the book, in a holistic way. Let's begin with what the levels of complexity that he's trying to deal with in this book. First of all, there's what we would expect, which is foreign policy analysis. But also, this is woven together with the complex, indeed intricate, structures of domestic political structures and processes in Brazil itself, and with cultural norms as well of Brazil, which have an influence, which play a part in the formation and the carrying out of Brazilian foreign policy. So I found it an extraordinarily interesting book, but also a very skillful book in the way that it's been put together, and a book which is based on vast research, including, I think, 75 interviews at least in 6 countries with practitioners of Brazilian foreign policy and those directly interacting with it. So we begin with Brazil, which, with all its weaknesses, is a colossus with one would think, great potential power. Often a potential power, as he points out in the book, which is unrealised. It has the 7th or 8th largest gross domestic product in the world. With over 200 million people, it has the 6th largest population, vast mineral resources, of course, including enormous oil reserves offshore. It is the 5th largest land area of any country in the world, larger than Australia, and unlike Australia, it has plentiful water and much more arable land. Brazil, as Sean points out in the subtitle of the book, is a giant on certainly the Latin American stage, but indeed on the world stage. And in much of the period that Sean deals with in this book, it's perhaps even more important than those figures might indicate. It's more important because for most of that period, from the late 1990s on, Brazil is emerging from an economic morass in which it is a major world debtor, in which there is sluggish, if any, economic growth, in which it's generally considered in the world stage to be an economic basket case. And it's emerging around that period into the millennial commodities boom, which is one of the factors greatly spurring economic growth in Brazil. It becomes a creditor on the world stage rather than a debtor. And Brazilian companies start to reach out much more into the rest of the world, not just in trade, as they had in the past, but in foreign direct investment. So Brazil's importance on the world stage grows dramatically in the period of the foreign policy that Sean's looking at in this book. But for such a giant, one of the difficulties for perhaps theorists or commentators, especially those who've been trained in the realist school of international relations, is to try to understand why it doesn't seem that Brazil in this period, despite this power, despite these advantages, and despite this advance in this period, does not seem to have projected its power in a traditional realist way. That is, to increase its power on the international stage vis-a-vis other players. That is a classical power projection, and sought instead, as Sean argues in the book, to, and I quote, to embed Brazilian interests in the very fabric of the regional and international system. Now we throw into this conundrum, perhaps, and this complex mix, an extremely complex set of internal structural and political processes domestically, in which none of the three presidents dealt with in Sean's book primarily have a majority in Congress, and are therefore forced to form difficult coalitions, sometimes unstable and changing coalitions domestically, and in the process of forming those coalitions to offer and to reward coalition partners and sometimes sections of one's own party even by increasing their leverage over different aspects of the Brazilian government and public policy. Now the interesting thing, I think, is that very few of those partners, those coalition partners and those allies were particularly interested in foreign policy, because it seemed to be more the domestic public policy portfolios that interested them, because there were perhaps obvious rewards for which regional groupings and other interest-based groupings could benefit by taking parts of or having the leverage over significant sections of the domestic political and public policy formation apparatus. So foreign policy therefore was not seen as particularly important by a large section of the political establishment inside Brazil, and did not become therefore a major part of the discussion, of the political dialogue going on inside Brazil. Adding to this relative, and I use the term advisedly, relative lack of interest in foreign policy, we have a situation where all of Brazil's borders, 10 borders, I think, have been secure for a very long period. And no serious security threats, therefore, have presented themselves to Brazil, and certainly not in this period. Moreover, what we have is a situation where Brazil has been largely aside from the major international conflicts, certainly since the Second World War. And again, foreign policy, concern over foreign policy, has been much less than might have been expected in other countries of Brazil's international weight, size, and importance. There's another factor which I think is very important to understand, and that is the people and the institutions which actually formulate foreign policy. We can analyse foreign policy, its motivations and its effects, but ultimately it's people who make it, and institutions who make it and interpret it and carry it out. And we have in Brazil, I think, an interesting and perhaps almost unique foreign policy establishment, Itamaraty, after the building in which it was originally housed in Rio, the foreign ministry. And this is an extraordinarily elite section of the Brazilian public policy apparatus. Very tiny number of people are selected from a huge number of applicants. They are extremely well trained, they are extremely talented, gifted people, and they are also trained within the institution itself for a considerable period in its own institution, the Rio Bravo Institute. Partly in the norms of international processes in foreign policy, formation, analysis, interpretation, and so on, the norms of diplomatic practice, in other words, but also in the culture and environment of Itamaraty itself, which has had a long history, and a long history with its own traditions, its own culture created inside. And so recruits to it are schooled in that culture and therefore begin to think of themselves as part of an institution which should formulate foreign policy. It's been said, not just by Sean, I think, but by many other people writing on the foreign ministry in Brazil, that this is an institution which sees itself as making foreign policy not just for the government, but actually for the state. And that it's the experts in foreign policy formation who should be left to do that. Now, that, while it had been perhaps a reality, comes up against the changes in foreign policy which begin to emerge in the 1990s and through into this century. When presidents attempt to deal with the foreign ministry and carry out this new foreign policy agenda, they create new interactions now with the foreign ministry. Presidential diplomacy becomes an important factor in the mixture of what's happening. I was also very interested to see the way in which Sean talks about some of the cultural dimensions of Brazilian life and society and the way in which they might have an impact upon Brazilian foreign policy. A society in which a direct and a blunt no might be rare. The tendency is to continue to talk and to negotiate and so on. I think one of the interesting examples of this, and Sean mentions it, but also a former colleague wrote a book from this school, in fact, Zuleika Arashira, about the free trade area of the Americas. And in the process which has begun in the United States, the US is trying to create some kind of free trade area throughout the Western Hemisphere. Brazil is by and large opposed to this, but doesn't simply say no, but rather keeps asking questions, keeps making proposals, and the process goes on for years, and eventually, of course, people realise that it's never going to happen. I think it's an interesting way in which perhaps cultural dimensions here coincide with the way in which foreign policy is carried out. Three elements of foreign policy objectives begin to emerge anew, or perhaps are reinforced in the period that Sean is looking at. The first is the continuing need for foreign policy to serve the needs of development, more than to serve the needs perhaps of security because of the relative lack of security threats, but to serve the needs of development in trade and in investment and technology transfer and other needs of development in a context which does not reduce the autonomy of Brazilian public policy formation. So Brazil has been very keen to advance its diplomacy for development, but to do so in such a way that doesn't hem it in, that doesn't restrict it in what it does domestically. The second is the opening up, beginning in the early 1990s, actually a little before the three presidents that Sean is primarily dealing with, of higher levels of cooperation in the region, beginning perhaps with Mercosul in Portuguese, and through the southern cone of Latin America in a range of economic, political and security institutions. Simply the creation of these institutions and agreements and new norms of cooperation are situations in which Brazil, because of its size and weight, will be able to expand its influence, sometimes to the annoyance of its neighbours. The third is a more ambitious attempt to play a leading role in South-South cooperation, the BRIC, for example. And in all of this, the aim of Brazilian foreign policy has not been to tear up the global institutions of international organisation, to attack them, the WTO, for example, and other similar institutions, but rather to argue and to push for more space within them, for an enhanced role within them, and for different norms within them. All of these are shown in the book to be dynamic processes. What began with some of this agenda under President Cardoso was expanded under Lula from 2002 with different emphasis, for example, on the solidarity of the global south in the case of Lula, and probably with much less enthusiasm and little, if any, increased effort under Dilma Rousseff. This, I think, is a masterly piece of work, and I congratulate Sean for producing it. Sean mentions a quote, repeats a quote in the book, that because of the great complexity of Brazil, Brazil is not for amateurs. And as a rank amateur on Brazil, I'm now going to step aside and ask the professional to talk about his book. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much, John, for those very kind words. And I think if there's one thing we've learned over the last 3 months, I was in Sao Paulo about 4 weeks ago today when a rather infamous piece of news about the largest meatpacking company in the world came out. And then President Temer looked like he was about to fall overnight. And I think what we've learned is that, I don't think anybody at the moment fully understands what's going on with Brazil. It's become extraordinarily complicated. What I'd like to do at the beginning is I just want to start by thanking a couple of people, because this book obviously did not happen solely off my own back. And the first thanks has to go out to the Australian Research Council, who funded the book and arranged for me to have the time that was needed to do it. And then here in the school, two chairs in particular, John Ravenhill and our current chair, Andrew Banfield, have done a fabulous job of sheltering me from all sorts of administrative wins and ills so that I was able to do it. And then, of course, within NCLAS, John Minns has been an invaluable source of counsel and discussion to sort out what was going on, and also just the general operations of NCLAS. We have a very positivist school here. You come with your hypothesis, you set up your data, and you test it. And it's a very neat, quasi-scientific way of doing social sciences, but you also don't necessarily get at the key, the grit of what's going on. And one of the things that NCLAS has allowed with all of the people who've come in is that to get the dust into your veins and to sort of get a sense of the ephemeral aspects that you need to understand what's going on. So for that, I have a great deal of thanks to the ANCLAS community, to my colleagues at ANCLAS, and also to my colleagues at SPEAR. The other bit that's been very important getting the book done was the Latin American diplomatic community. I've been constantly amazed at how fast it's grown in just 6 years, because it seems to have almost doubled in size. And also the engagement level and the willingness, particularly of some of the ambassadors who are now running essentially their foreign policies within South America, to engage in extended discussions. Likewise, Brazil's diplomats. I have a Brazilian colleague in Canada who is constantly amazed that I'm able to do what I do. He says, because they seem to like you. They seem to keep talking to you. You're really, really hard on them, but they keep coming back and they keep talking to me. And the discussions that I've had, and I've interviewed now probably close on to 80 different diplomats, from ranks from the third secretary right up to president, foreign minister. And they've been unfailingly generous in their time and their assistance in both logistical terms and in terms of getting access to data. And of course, I need to thank my family, because this was not easy on them, as no writing of a book is. I think in a lot of ways, John has done maybe a better job of summarizing the book than I can. I think this is probably common, you get too close to it. But what the book really is that it's an extended foreign policy analysis. And the rationale for the book comes out of my time working in the Government of Canada and also doing a large number of public outreach and government outreach activities here in Canberra, and the kind of questions that I would get asked about Brazil. Why is Brazil doing this? Why are they such a problem? What's going on with here or there or this issue? And there's nothing really out there to answer those questions. There was about 5 or 6 books in English came out around 2010. None of them really touched upon what you need to get to grips with the foreign policy. So the book in itself is an extended exercise in foreign policy analysis. And in the introduction, I talk about a sort of a non-theory of theorizing Brazil. And so it's not built on the heavy theoretical structures that we tend to do with academic books. There's no 80, 90-page discourse on all the different theoretical approaches. But there is a theoretical underpinning, and it's very much in the line of critical theory and the British School of Political Economy. So key things to keep in the back of your mind are Susan Strange's idea of structural power, conceptions of hegemony that draw on people like Robert Cox and William I. Robinson, which is very different than the realist approach. And also major elements of the kind of thinking that you find in Cardoso and Fileto's book, Dependency and Development, a very particular stream of understanding how the capitalist world works. So there's 2 arguments that run through the book, and these are not going to be a surprise to you, Ambassador, because this is the milk blood of what we do. 1, Brazilian foreign policy is about protecting national autonomy. Okay, fine. This is what all countries do, but it's useful to restate that and to remember that, and it's very explicit, and it's repeated over and over in strategic documents. And the second one, and this is one that I often had to remind people of when I worked in the Canadian International Development Agency, the public policy priorities in a country like Brazil are extraordinarily different than they are in a country like Australia. In Australia, development for us is a hobby, right? In Brazil, it is the fundamental public policy priority. Now, whether you think that, even if you dissect the kind of policies Temer is putting forward and you chastise him for being far out on the right, look at what he's doing. He's trying to find a way for national development to raise up the lower income classes, the bottom quintiles, to create a sense of national development, which is what you need for growth, which is what you need for security and stability. The argument is about how to do that, not that that's what needs to be done. And that comes through in foreign policy, that the foreign policy is fundamentally designed to advance these two elements, to protect Brazil's autonomy and to advance national development. And if you keep these two things in mind, very often the kind of positions that Brazil takes in international forum or the activities that it undertakes start to make a little bit more sense, and you can see start to trace out the path that they're following. So talk about the book a bit, the way it's set up. There's 11 chapters to it. It's broken up into roughly 3 sections. The first section just looks at the domestic political context and a couple of general trends and techniques that you find repeated throughout Brazilian foreign policy practice, the kinds of things that the diplomats tend to use as devices to advance their agenda. Second section looks at issue areas, so it looks at multilateralism, trade policy, Brazil Inc., which is what I'm spending a lot of time looking at now and which is what's all over your newspapers. When the book was written, I think probably in hindsight, I was given the signals that something was wrong with Odebrecht. I think there was a comment that someone said to me in Angola when I asked about the board membership of Odebrecht in Angola, and if there were Angolans on it, and I was told, sure, there's some Angolans on the board. And I said, well, what kind of positions do they have? What do they do? And the person paused, and they looked at me, and they said, they bring other aptitudes, which would be, of course, access to the Santos family, avenues for suitcases of money, which now is very much a story, but wasn't one when I looked at the book. Security policy is the fourth issue area. And then in terms of bilateral relationships, I've got a chapter on Latin America, the global south, one on the United States and one on China. And there's lots of things that are left out in this book, but it's 240-something pages, it's about 112,000 words. There's limits to what people can read, there's limits to what one person can do. To write a truly comprehensive book on Brazil's foreign policy, you're going to be out at sort of 12 to 14,000 pages quite easily. So, in some respects, possibly where you get the strongest argument is in section 2, when I'm talking about the different issue areas. And so what I might do here, and trying to be fairly quick to keep your attention, is to quickly go through the argument in a couple of these chapters. The first one in multilateralism, this is very important for Brazil, and there's a contradiction in Brazilian foreign policy, which is, you read things like the 1993 Reflexões sobre a Política Externa, which was this massive internal consultation exercise. And there's an embedded contradiction that we want to be an autonomous sovereigntist country, and we're universalist, but we also want to be subscribed to multilateralism. The problem is, if you're going to subscribe to multilateralism, it means at some point you may need to actually start to surrender a degree of autonomy to facilitate the multilateral organization. And so you wind up with a tension in here. So what you find in the Brazilian case is that the multilateralism and the multilateral institutions get used as devices to protect autonomy. So you can use them to deflect pressures on you. You can use them to coordinate actions that you may not want to have attributed to you directly, but you feel need to happen. So what we find, or what I find, looking through various multilateral organizations, is that when things are aligning with what Brazil wants, then everything's fine. There's not really any problem. But when the multilateral organization starts to push in a direction that Brazil finds difficult or not consistent with the larger foreign policy goals, then you find a great deal of resistance. So we can look at this and see it very, very clearly in the Americas. The relationship between Brazil and the Organization of American States is complicated. Right now, the OAS is liked because Brazil's got its own internal problems to deal with. It has a massive security problem and public health problem with Venezuela, yet it needs a device through which it can advance this. So at the moment, there's quite a lot of favor for the OAS. But this has not always been the case. There have been instances in the past where it's looked like Brazil is trying to shut down the OAS. One of the examples that's put forward at times is when Baiana Suarez was appointed as the Secretary General, and that the argument someone made is like, but what's going on with you, the OAS? I mean, you seem to support it. They go, you sent Baiana Suarez, you sent your best diplomat. And the response was, well, yes, we sent the best diplomat we have with very specific instructions, which was to slow it down and paralyze it. Under the Lula years, we see strong contestation for the space of the OAS in Latin America. We see the rise of UNASUR, particularly as a political entity. And Celso Amorim in his the various memoirs that he's written sort of give some interesting insights in how UNASUR was used not only as a deflection to deflect the attention of the United States and the OAS and the pressure from the OAS and North America from being exerted in South America, but also to contain Chavez. So the way that you funnel people in and use the structures and the processes to contain things. CELAC is another one, the Community of Latin American Caribbean Nations, which in Ottawa, when I was in government, it was being referred to as the OAS +1 - 2, because they included Cuba, but they wouldn't let the North Americans in. And there was no way for the North Americans to get near it, and they asked and asked and asked. Now, the critical point here, and this is the argument throughout the whole of the book, and it's one that OECD member diplomats, which now would almost include Brazil soon, need to keep in mind, is that Brazil's playing a structural power game. They're not playing a relational power game. So they're not trying to get, as Gianluca Gardini, who's now in Germany, put this really beautifully, Brazil is not seeking power over others. Brazil is consistently seeking power to do. So rather than trying to have power to force another actor to go in a particular direction, what Brazil is trying to do is get within the operating structures and discuss how the rules are interpreted and what sort of space that opens up for foreign policy. And this becomes very interesting when you get to elements like trade policy in Brazil and the Brazil link. And in some ways, what Brazil has done on the trade policy front, when you look at the WTO, is in fact even more orthodox in a neoliberal sense than what's coming out of Washington or Brussels. And that throughout the Doha round of the WTO, Brazil's big point was, you can't subsidize agriculture, it's a trade distortion. So we can bring the tariff barriers down, that's fine, but you can't do it if you have agricultural subsidies in place in Europe or you're running with quotas. Or, to put Australia on the spot, AQUIS, which is just another trade distortion. So the idea there is not to turn the apple cart over, but to try and find a way to expand the space for what they're good at. Mercosur fits into this in a sort of way as well, because Mercosur, it's notionally a trade bloc, and right now it's problematic. But when it was launched in the 1990s, it was framed in large part as an incubator approach, that we have all of these companies in Brazil that are not going to survive on a national basis. They need to become globally competitive. But if we drop them into the international market right now, most of them will drown. So you use the framework of the Southern Cone Common Market as a slightly bigger space to increase competitiveness. And this is where you get a difference between the Brazilian view and the Argentine view on Mercosur. The Brazilians were always looking to go the next step on a policy level, firms maybe not, whereas the Argentines were always looking internally. So again, it's not a contestation per se of neoliberalism or liberal economics or global free trade. It's playing with the spaces, the margins, to try and create room for Brazil to be able to do what it wants to do within that. There's also in Brazil some of the old guard PSDB, PMDB voices who retired at the beginning of Lula made quite a little bit of an industry of attacking the realignment of Brazil's foreign policy in a south-south direction, saying that the engagement with Africa was a bad idea and that this idea of more attention should have been given to the United States and Western Europe than the global South. Traditionally, this fits with the view that's been, that's attributed to Brazil's foreign policy, that you want to be on the Elizabeth Arden circuit and that you're trying to become of the Northern Core, part of the Northern Core. The interesting thing that happens, and one of the things I look at in this book, is when you start to look at the changing nature of the Brazilian economy. And as the Brazilian agro-industrial sector grew in the 1990s and became very strong in the 2000s, their markets were in the South. So when you look at the shift in the direction of political engagement that you have under Lula and Amorim, particularly to parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, it tracks almost exactly with where you have changes in shipments of beef, of sugar, of chicken, and a whole range of other agricultural commodities. And that's before we even start to talk about things like coal and iron ore or soy. So again, what's going on in this trade policy element, it's opening up new market space. It's not saying we need to have an exclusionary approach. It's saying we can trade with the North, but we can also trade with the South. in a sense, the idea being encourage South-South economic relations to increase the size of the pie and not worry so much about the size of your slice, if you will. So again, it's an overarching structural theme. In this case, though, it's the idea that the North is not the only option. Brazil Inc. fits into the same model here. Where do you go? What does it you do? So government discourse is typically tied up on trade volumes. A very revealing comment was made to me by an Apex official, that's the Brazilian Trade Cooperation Promotion guys, in Luanda. And he said to me, look, trade's last year's game. It's all about foreign direct investment now. And so you start to track the outward expansion of Brazilian firms. And with the Lula years, you have this sudden surge in resource development and also construction development throughout large parts of South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this chapter is a bit problematic at the moment because it was finished in late 2014. And anyone know the name Odebrecht? And its structural operations unit? And the fine they paid to the SEC of $3.8 billion for, they may have been negotiated down for some rather astounding levels of bribery. That aside, when Odebrecht would go out or Vale would go out and invest, they would bring a string of other Brazilian companies behind them. And this is where one of the big elements in the structural transformation of the Lula administration comes in. It's not so much worrying about trade, it's looking for opportunities that you can find abroad to invest. And on the structural level, what's interesting with this is it's south to south. And when you go and talk to economic actors in various parts of the community Portuguese-speaking nations or countries like Tanzania and South Africa, the directionality of where you need to be going. Do you need to be going through Western Europe or North America, or can you just go direct across? And do you need to be actually trading, or can you be setting up joint ventureships? So it's changing the structural sense of what's going on and amplifying the opportunities without actually changing the overarching structural model. Finally, on the security front, as John said, there's no traditional security threats to Brazil. Nobody's going to invade. And Brazil's not going to invade anybody else. Now, this doesn't mean that security is a non-issue. There's, what is it, correct me if I got it wrong, 60,000 people were murdered extrajudicially last year? And if you go to the list, there's a list just came out of the most dangerous cities in the world, and like 18 of the top 21 are in Brazil. There is a major security problem in Brazil, but it's not in the traditional zone of thinking about another country invading. So that creates an interesting space for what Brazil can do with its security policy. And over the Lula and Dilma years, you had two official documents come out. You had the National Defense Policy and a white paper on defense. And they're fascinating documents to read because they map out a couple of things that are really important. First one, why rely on the North? Why do you need to buy your weapons from the North? Why can't we build them ourselves? And so you get the reconditioning of the Brazilian military helicopter fleet in conjunction with Eurocopters being done in Sao Bernardo do Campos, with a lot of the research and the R&D is actually taking place in Brazil. Country where I'm living now, Canada, has just announced $80 billion in defense spending, including a whole bunch of new jets, and they're probably going to buy F-35s, which is really ridiculous given that the explanation is that we need to not be dependent on the United States. Brazil had the option to buy F-18s. They went with Saab. And they're building a new generation of Saab fighter jets, again in Sao Bernardo do Campos with Embraer, which means all of that technology, the avionics, the propulsion systems, and so on, are being partially developed and partially owned by Brazil, which drives forward a whole new industrial sector. So when you track through a lot of the security policy, it actually becomes a national development policy. And it fits with what we know about organizations like DARPA in the US, that if you engage in defense research and development, you have an awful lot of commercial spin-offs. So I asked one admiral in the Navy, what on earth are you going to do with a nuclear-powered submarine? Like, are you really that worried about people coming in with submarines to take the subsalt oil fields? And he gave me the typical line about, well, national sovereignty, patrolling the water, and so on, and all of this. And I was like, but he's like, but really, think about it. The most complicated thing on this planet that you can build is a nuclear submarine. If we figure out how to do that with the engineering skills, and we have them here, what else can we do? So it's about developing skill sets. The other interesting part that comes out of security policy is, again, it's a structural change. It's redirecting attention. So Old world, 1990s, you have a security problem in Latin America, you go to the United States for help. The new world now, what do? You talk to your neighbors and come up with a solution. And this has gone to an incredible length lately, which has really upset the left in Brazil, that there's a military exercise going to take place in, it's in Amazonas, isn't it, in the north, up by the border with Colombia and Peru. And it's traditionally, there's an exercise between the Brazilian military, the Colombian, and the Peruvian to manage this remote space. And they've now invited the Americans to come, which becomes very interesting in the context of some of the things that Admiral Kidd is saying. Go across the Atlantic, Zopacas, the Zone of Peace and Security in the Southern Atlantic. Has anybody heard of that? Probably not here, because it's too far away. There had long been talk in Western capitals about the need for South Atlantic Treaty Organization, which of course nobody's interested in. But with Zopacas, what you have is a concerted attempt to coordinate training activities and information sharing on the littoral countries of the Southern Atlantic so that you can do basic things. Coastal patrol for national security reasons, search and rescue, resource surveying, and also anti-piracy activities without requiring the presence of the United Kingdom, Spain, or the United States, which means you can start to create your own realities and build your own partnerships and your own ways forward. Again, all within the overarching liberal security order that we have, but managed and run independently. So the overarching goal here, effectively, Brazil's going for its own autonomy. This is clear, and I've written in the past using Franz Fanon to talk about the autoestima, the self-esteem, the confidence to do things on its own that Brazil had in the 2000s, and it's still there. It's distracted at the moment, but it's still there. But a big part of what's been going on under the Lula years and inertially through Dilma was to push this out to the global south and to come up with new realities and new solutions to existing problems. Okay, so this has been a success universally? No, not even close. And no foreign policy ever is an unmitigated success. And you have the Latin American pushback, particularly seen through the Pacific Alliance. I've got a group of scholars, colleagues of mine, and I'm working on a book with them, and they are arguing that it's an exercise of balancing against an overambitious Brazil. I keep turning back to them saying, I think really what the problem is that they asked for Brazil to lead and Brazil didn't put the leadership goods on the table. But either way, the fact that something like the Pacific Alliance is conceptualized and advanced traces back to the kind of ideas that Brazil's pushing. Southern countries do unto themselves together. You don't need to go through the North. The other bit is the United States and this. It's one of the things I track through in the book, and this is an argument I'm going to make elsewhere, is that the United States is not the bogeyman that it used to be. Yet this is a consistent jamming point when we go through Brazilian foreign policy reactions to it. We've seen it was last week or 2 weeks ago that the accession to the process for the OECD was mentioned, was announced. Yeah. From what I can see, having been in an agency that had to report to the OECD, the real problem with being in the OECD is that you all of a sudden have to devote people to filling out reports. And people come in and pry into your affairs and give you commentary on what you're doing. You get to do it to them as well. But the reaction has been catastrophic in some sectors, that this is an abdication of sovereignty, we've completely given in, we will have our policy directions imposed, we will lose all freedom over what we can do, which completely ignores the plurality of policy options that you have within the OECD. So there's a psychological shift that's still kind of sticking and still sort of being sorted through. Matthias Spector put together an excellent collection for the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio de Janeiro with 10 different chapters at 10 different areas and things that need to be looked at. And there's this tension about doing this. And Hussein Kaluchi, who's the Secretary of, I always get the translation wrong with the letters. It's the Secretary of Strategic Affairs, Asuntos Estratégicos, yeah, attached to the presidency. He's put out a 25-page paper looking at Brazilian foreign policy, and basically argument is, where's our grand strategy? What do we do with all of this? And not much has happened. Paulo Roberto has had a few things to say, as he does, and a couple of other people have made a couple of comments, but there's not been much discussion. But this idea that Brazil can do things and go forward, it's it's stuck, and this is kind of where I come to in the book. Brazil's got to this point where it's creating the structural changes. But to go back to what John was talking about, the domestic context, there's no political discussion about now what? What do we do with it? Where do we go with it? So, in sum, what would I say is that the argument I put forward, and I hedge a bit in the conclusion, because at the time when I wrote it, I wasn't sure if Dilma was going to be president or not and what was going to happen. But I think the argument continues through. It's the idea of trying to advance the interest through structural change. Now, the aggressiveness with which that happens, as John pointed out, depends on the engagement of the presidency. And again, the political engagement. Where that's going to go, we'll see. Security Council one's an interesting one, because the popular rhetoric is that Brazil is opposed to the responsibility to protect doctrine, which isn't true, because Brazil has in fact actually called for it to be used a number of times. What Brazil has a real problem with is mission creep. And my understanding is that there was a fair bit of unease about the language and the use of R2P in Libya, but it was a kind of like, we'll trust you on this. Okay, fine, we'll go with this. And then it was manipulated and blown far out of proportion. So the response that came out of Brazil, and this isn't, I got a colleague, Kai Kenkel in Rio, is doing a lot of work on this, and Adrian Abdenor, and that whole crowd at around Puki Rio there. The response that came out was a codicil called responsibility while protecting, so that if you're going to go in and intervene on the RTP doctrine, then you then need to be responsible for collateral civilian damage and so on, and you need to plan appropriately. And, Kai's comment about this is really spot on. He's like, they came up with this interesting idea, it was put forward, and not surprisingly, the United States and Europe went, hell no. And instead of continuing to maintain the pressure and to continue to do the negotiation, they backed off a bit, perhaps more than they should have. And this is one of these interesting things, is that the expression in Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. But what happened in the 2000s is Brazil became the country of the future. And when you become the country of the future and you have that seat at the main table and you've become one of the essential players. And I talk to people in policy communities in different countries at the moment, and Brazil's gone largely quiet because it's got some serious issues to deal with at home. There's not a lot of oxygen left for foreign policy. But they go, where's Brazil? What's happened? We need them because they're very useful and productive. But when they arrived, it was like, well, now we're here. What do we do? Where do we go with this? And the temptation is to turn and to blame the diplomats. The diplomats are bureaucrats. They respond to political direction. And so the question was, you put RWPs put forward, where you go with that needs some political backing from Brasilia. So if you don't get the political engagement to push that forward, then you stall out. And I think there's a big debate needs to happen in Brazil, very wide-ranging. Matias has tried to start it with his paper. Calucci is trying to start it with his. I think it's not a propitious time for it. But Brazil matters. Brazil's known in the world. And you've arrived. Now, what do you do? What's your project? And you have to have some way to communicate that. And that's the bit that I don't have an answer to, and I don't think it needs to be hashed out through the democratic process. And, the last presidential election was 13 seconds of debate on foreign policy over 15 hours of presidential debate, and it was all about contraband in the tri-border area. So it's not there. It was another question you had, was it? BRICS. Yeah. 2010, when I talked to some people at Itamaraty about the BRICS, I was told they had been explicitly instructed to pursue it in a manner that was disposable, because IPSA was seen as being far more substantive. Your thing with the BRICS, besides the Goldman Sachs report written in 2003, what unifies the BRICS countries? Why would we assume? The only thing that unifies the BRICS countries is that they are not part of the traditional power structures. But the interests that Brazil, South Africa, and India have in political development terms, given their democratic nature, are vastly different than China and Russia. You have vastly different preoccupations in terms of public policy needs between the different countries. Like, there's not a lot to hold them together. And I think you can see that, it's sort of everybody's along, they agree, and they always put the stuff that they're going to disagree with off on the side. They focus on the stuff that's easy to agree on. So I kind of a dodge, but explicit discussion of the Amazon, no, because when the book was originally put together, there was thought of doing a chapter on environmental issues, which would have made the Amazon extremely important. And then you run up against the inevitability of, do you do it badly or do you not do it? And I couldn't really bring myself to write that chapter and know that Kathy Hochstetler was going to read it and call me up and go, what the hell are you doing? Because it's such a complicated issue. The Amazon comes into play to a certain extent with the idea behind, and I don't remember if I mentioned this in there or not, but there was always this, part of the autonomy thing is this terror that the Amazon's going to be taken away, that it'll be seized as a world good that Brazil can't maintain. So you have a context then where the military classifies international non-governmental organizations that are interested in the environment as de facto terrorist groups and organizations which are going to act contrary to the Brazilian national interests. And this ricochets on that there's a law in place which probably I could be subjected to, that foreigners who make commentary on Brazilian politics can be either expelled or jailed. Right? And I don't think we have that in this country. But it's that same sense of, it's a very closed down and protected that, people are out to get us. And on the BRICS thing, the China chapter might be more interesting in a sense, because the China chapter is a story of how Brazil just missed what was going on and has now become at risk of becoming dependent. Everybody else thinks they can control the Chinese, but I've interviewed a couple of Chinese diplomats for this book, and they are scary. They are very bright, very clever. They give nothing away. But you ask a question they don't like, and they give this very awkward little laugh. And they know what they're doing. I had one in Geneva told me, it's like, we're just watching, we're observing. We're sorting out where we'll go. We're not in a hurry. Brazil can make all the noise for the moment. That's fine. It's but Brazil is sucking in monumental quantities of foreign direct investment. So you go to Sao Paulo. I spent the week in Sao Paulo talking to political risk guys, and all of them are looking at how they have their operations structured, all the companies, international companies, structured in Brazil to make sure that the legal frameworks are structured in a way that satisfies the requisites of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at the SEC. So the companies come in and they invest and they try to form up as a Brazilian. Now, a Brazilian company sets up in Brazil and it grows. Then what do? Now, the companies I'm talking about, when I say, it's about investment, it's not about trade. What is it we're talking about? The big Brazilian companies that have gone out, and this is the bit that gets skipped over. It's Odebrecht, Quiroz Galvão gave me this pen, Andrade Gutierrez, OEA, Petrobras, Votorantim, which is a cement company. These are all resource companies in construction, right? So you can't export a physical product. You have to go and open up a new market. And then oftentimes, this is the different quirk you get with the Brazilian companies. When they show up in your country, like I talked to the Odebrecht guys in Mozambique and Maputo, and they said, well, we came here to build the mine for Vale at Moatize, which is an $8 billion project. We've done that. So we're now building an airport in Nacala, and we're looking around for what else we can do. So we're thinking that we might do a vertically integrated supply chain for chicken or cassava. We haven't decided which. We're looking at building condo complexes, and then do we sell them or do we manage them for all of the gas exploration that's going to happen with ENI and Anadarko? So it's a different mentality.
All right.
And when Odebrecht makes $1 billion in Mozambique, where does it remit back to? Well, the PT Treasury and the PMDB Treasury, but that's a different story. It goes back to Brazil. So it's the same idea with Apple. How much does Apple actually make in the United States, but how much money do they remit back into the American economy? So if you're going to move up your value chain and you're going to go from being, rather than just a digger in the earth and a grower of stuff, which is Australia, and it's also Brazil, and you want to move up to the high value added, where you're doing the design work and the back office and all of the brain power stuff, I guess you want to call it that, you need to be looking at investment sites to grow your firms. So I think that's part of the logic of it. The other bit is, Brazil's manufacturing industry got slammed by the Chinese on a cost competitive basis. Yeah. And the logistical costs in Brazil are so damn high to get a container off of that country. There is no way that you can compete. I talked to one diplomat from Sudan who was talking to a Brazilian married to a Sudanese woman, knows Brazil, loves Brazil, has all the suppliers in Brazil, buys all the stuff from China. And he turned to the diplomat and he said, if you can match the shipping cost, by all means I'll go buy it in Rio Grande do Sul. But it's 3 times more expensive by the time I get it here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.